Okay, weeks ago we got up to here. This is the third chapter of Yoma, Mishnah Hay. And quick reminder, the beginning of the Mishnah, beginning of this chapter, the Mimunet tells them, go out and see if it's time for Shlita. And then they do the Shlita. And so now, right, and then here, because, so we learned that basic Mishnah in Tamid, and over here we're discussing in Yoma how the Kohen Gadol started to do the Avodah on Yom Kippurim. So here, of course, there isn't going to be a pais for the Shvita because the Kohen Gadol himself has to do the Shvita. So we saw that in Mishnah Bet that they take to toggle in the mikvah, and that mikvah is outside of the Azara because he needs to be tahor in order to enter into the Azara. But all the other tefillot, we'll see, we're in the Azara. So now it's saying. At the end of Mishnah Daled, after he taveled, he put on the bigdei zahav, right? So he puts on the regular clothing of the Kohen Gadol, and then they brought him the korban tamid, kratzo umerek acher shlita al yado. So he would kratzo, which meant that he would kill it with the beginning of the shlita to cut most of the windpipe and the jugular vein, and then another kohen should off so that the Kohen Gadol could take the kli and capture the blood that's coming from the shlita. Then it says nichnas k'tir k'toret shel shachar. Then he went in to do the k'toret of the morning. Ulhetiv et hanerot, ulhakriv et harosh v'et ha'evarim, v'et hachavitin v'et hayayin. So we're basically fair with all of these things, but what we want to talk about now a little bit is the order that they're being presented. So we see in the next Mishnah, which we looked at 2 weeks ago, K'toret shel shachar hayta kreva bein dam la'evarim. The K'toret of the morning was brought between the dam and the evarim, between the time of the dam was sprinkled on the mizbeach korban tamid, until the time the evarim would be taken and put onto the mizbeach. So we looked at the Bartanura last time, and he said, "Ben dam la'evarim, lav dafka." It's not explicit, not exactly. Dahatanan la'el v'kibelet adam uzrako nichnas l'ktir k'toret. Because we learned earlier that when he captures the blood and then sprinkles it on the mizbeach, right? This was the Mishnah Daled that we just read. And then after he sprinkles the blood, he goes in to burn the k'toret, ulheitiv et hanerot, to clean up the nerot of the menorah, and then ulhakriv et harosh v'et ha'evarim, and then to bring the head and the rest of the limbs of the korban tamid. Alma hayta k'toret kreva bein dam lanerot, v'lo bein dam la'evarim. So we see from the previous Mishnah that the K'toret was not done exactly, as it were, between the dam and the evarim. It was done after the dam. It was done bein dam, and before he did the neirot. So why does it say here bein dam evarim? It should have said bein dam neirot. So, Ela ba hatana achshav lomar lo ba hatana achshav lomar seder hakrabot zu achar zu echayu. The Tana is not coming now to sort of give me the exact laundry list of the things that were being brought in the Beit HaMikdash, this after the next. אבל רצה לומר בלבד שלא הייתה דם והקרבת האיברים מצופים זו אחר זו. It just wants to emphasize that the sprinkling of the blood and bringing the limbs of the animal onto the Mizbeach did not come one right after the other. Because here, for example, it's an example that the Ketara was interrupted between those two avodot. It's also true that cleaning up the lights of the menorah was in between them and after the Ketara. It was also in between the Dam and the Evarim, but it was after the Kodem HaKravata Evarim. Okay, so that's just a clarification that we're not being, the Mishnah here is not telling me exactly when the Ketara Shel Shachar was, but generally it was between the Dam and the Evarim. Shel Ben HaArbaim, Ben Evarim LaNisachim. The Ketara that was brought in Ben HaArbaim afternoon, that was brought between the time that the Evarim were brought onto the Mizbeach and before the Nisachim, before the libations that accompanied the Korban Tamid Bayim. And we'll learn more about that later. Imaya Kohen Gadol Zaken Stinis, V'chamin Lo Chamin, Metilim L'toch HaTzonen, Kedei Shetaful Tzina. Okay, so this is going back to the idea that the Kohen had to do these chamesh tevilot. He had to tavel in the mikveh 5 times on Yom Kippurim. So sometimes the mikveh could be very cold. So if he was an Easternis, which Rashi explains means shegufo mitzunan v'kar, his body was chill and cold. So then they warm up hot water for him before Yom Kippur. That basically they could pour it into a trough that led into the mikvah to warm up the mikvah, the water of the mikvah. Shetafug tzinatan, in order to absorb the cold. Rashi says, "Lasir tzinatan b'miktzat," right? To remove some of the cold. Kamo mefigim ta'aman, like we see in Sachetza, where it's talking about herbs and spices. It describes them as they lose their taste. They're mefigim ta'aman. So now I want to go into this a little bit about the order, which is something we've been threatening to do for a long time. Let's do some of it at least today. The first thing I want to show you there are two Gemarot that we want to take a look at that discuss this issue. One of them is a guy in Daf Yoma Dalet Amud Bet in the first parak. One of them is the Gemara here in our parak. Look at this one first, and actually before I do, I also just want to remind you, before we look at the Gemara here, the Gemara here is referencing discussing the Mishnah in the first chapter. So what did we learn in the first chapter? Right? Kol shivat yamin hu zorek et adam, tira et aktoret, umeitir neirot, makriv et harosh v'et harega. So all the 7 days before Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol would do the following things. He would sprinkle the blood of the korbanot tamid. He would offer up the ktoret, the incense. Meitivet hanerot. He would clean up the lamps that were on the menorah. Umakriv et harosh v'et haregel. And he would bring up onto the mizbeach the head and the leg, which sounds like, here also, it sounds like knowing all of the things that have to be done seems like a shortened list. But at least on the list that we have, this is the order that he does things. First, Zoreket Adam. So obviously, Korban has to be shifted, and then he would sprinkle the blood, and then he would go into the Maktir Ktoret, then Mitivat Hanerot, and then go back outside and bring up the limbs onto the Mizbeach. So here the Gemara says, Maktirat Mitivat Hanerot. So the Gemara says, Alma Ktoret V'Reisha V'Handar Nerot. So based on this mishnah, we that first the Ktoret is brought, and afterwards the Nerot would be tended to. Riminhu. Well, we ask a kash on it from another mishnah. Misha zacha b'dishun mizbeach hapni, Misha zacha b'mnorah, Misha zacha b'ktoret. Right. So where's that mishnah from?
Tamid, Nahon?
Yeah. So we learned this in Masechet Tamid. Just a second. One second. Oh, you don't even see it. Hold on. I'm sorry. 1 second. Oh, okay. So yes. So we see it here in Tamid, Per Gimel Mishnah Vav. It says, Misha zacha b'dishun mizbeach hapnimi v'amnorah hayu maktivin. And it talks about the kelim that they had in their hands, ateni v'akuz u'shnei maftechot, and so forth. Basically, we learned this in the 3rd parak here in Tamid, this order. So why was important? Because here, in our mishnah here in the 1st parak of Yoma, it says the Ktoret precedes the Neirot. But in the mishnah in Tamid, it sounds like Misha zacha b'dishun mizbeach hapnimi, Misha zacha b'mnorah, Umisha zacha b'ktoret. So in our mishnah in the 1st chapter of Yoma, it says first he's maktir b'ktoret, and then he takes care of the neirot. But the order that we learn in Tamid is first there's a person who cleans off the mizbeach hapnimi the Mizbeach HaKtoret, and then the person who has to take care of the Neirot takes care of the Neirot. And then after him will be the person who actually is Maktoret, right? So that for our Mishnah in Yoma, it sounds like we should be being Maktir the Ktoret after we've taken care of the Neirot. So Amar Rav Huna, Man Tana Tamid, Rabbi Shimon Isha Mitzpehu. So wants to answer this question by saying the Mishnah in Yoma and the Mishnah in Tamid are actually attributed to different Tanaim. They have different source Tanaim. So Rav Huna offered the answer that Rabbi Shimon Isha Mitzpeh, he's the one who, tradition that's brought down in Masechet Tamid. He was the one who organized Masechet Tamid. But the Gemara doesn't like that answer because it says, actually, we learn the opposite. Why? Ditnan ba lo lekeren mizrachit tzfonit, noten mizrachat tzfona, ma'aravi dromit, noten ma'arava droma. Right, so just to review, this was also a mishnah in Tamid. This is at the beginning of the 4th chapter. Beginning of the 4th chapter. In the middle, we'll just skip to that part of the Mishnah. Shachata shochet v'kibel mikam. Right, so they set up the korban tamid for shchita. So the shochet shecht, the one who is capturing the blood, captures the blood, and then the one who captures the blood is going to go and sprinkle it onto the mizbeach. And we learned this at the time. Ba'alo lekeren mizrachit tzfonit. He would come to the northeast corner, the noten mizrach, and he would do one sprinkling in such a way that some would get on the north side and some would get on the east side. Then he would go to the southwest corner, and then he would do also one sprinkling, and it would go some on the west side and some on the south side. And okay, so that's the mishnah that we learned in Tamid. Taniela, but so the Gemara here quotes that mishnah from Tamid, and the Gemara continues and says, "V'ta Rabbi Shimon Isha Mitzpeh." So on that mishnah, there was a braita that we learned about Rabbi. It was said from Rabbi Shimon Isha Mitzpeh, Mishnah b'Tamid Mizrachit Tzfonit noten Mizrachat Tzafona, Ma'aravit Dromit noten Ma'arava v'achar kach noten Dora. Rabbi Shimon Isha Mitzpeh, when he learned Masechet Tamid, learned it differently, and he learned that the first sprinkling was just like the Tana Kama. You do the east and the north at the same time. But when you go down to the southwest corner, first he would sprinkle once on the west side, and then once on the east side, on the south side. Once on the west side and once on the south side. In other words, according to the Tana Kama, he only does two throwings, two sprinklings, and those sprinklings account for all 4 sides of the Mizbeach. According to Rabbi Shimon Isha Mitzpeh, you do 3. You do 1 at the northeast corner, but you do 2 at the southwest corner. So what do we see? Rabbi Shimon Isha Mitzpeh disagrees with the Mishnah in Tamid. So he can't have been the author of the Mishnah of Tamid as we have it. So that's a kasha on Rav Huna, he wanted to say that the Mishnah Tamid is Rabbi Shimon Isha Mitzpeh. Now we know that that can't be true. Ela amar Rabbi Yochanan man tana seder Yoma, Rabbi Shimon Ish HaMitzpeh. So we'll say it the other way. So it must be that our Mishnah here in Yoma that must be like Rabbi Shimon Isha Mitzpeh, because we know that he didn't learn the Seder that was brought in Tamid. So now, Rami Seder Yoma, a Seder Yoma, but now we're going to throw a Mishnah in Yoma from like the order that's brought here in Yoma, or the order of Yoma on the Mishnah in Yoma. Ditnan, Payis Hasheni, the second Payis, right? So this is brought here in our Mishnah in Yoma. It's also in Tamid, but it's what's important for this kasha is that both of these Mishnayot are going to be in Yoma. Payis Hasheni, this Payis was Mishochet, Mizorek, Mimidashen Mizbeach HaPnimi, Mimidashen Et HaMnorah, Mimalei Varim Lekevesh. Okay, so what do we see? The second, the Mishnah here, just a second. This is a Mishnah that we learned. This is in the second chapter. And we saw there was a parallel to this Mishnah in Tamid. But here, in the Mishnah, here in the second chapter, in the third Mishnah, this was the second Payis. Mishochet, Mizorek, Mimidashen Mizbeach HaPnimi, Mimidashen Et HaMnorah, Umimarim Lekevesh. And then it details all of those things, right? That there were 13 Kohanim that were Zocha to this Payis. So in the second Payis, we don't have what? We don't have Haktarat Haktoret. We have that's a Payis Hashli, Chadashim Haktoret Bo Vafisu. So what did we see in the first parak? Just a second. What did we see in the first parak? What are we discussing? That the Mishnah in the first parak was talking about the Kohen Gadol getting prepared for Yom Kippur, and there it says he was maktir the Ktoret before he did the Neirot. And yet, second chapter of Yoma, it seems to tell us that the order was different. The Hatavat Neirot would have been done before, because that was included in the second Payis, and the Haktarat Haktor is included in the third Payis, so it's after. So that's the kushya here in the Gemara. Gemara wants to understand, how can I reconcile these two Mishnayot here in Yoma? Right? Varani said the Yoma, I say the... Yes?
I think I already asked that question. Were these rabbis Kohanim? How do they know all these details?
Some of them were, in other words, whether or not they were Kohanim, I'm not sure about this one now. I'm not sure about the one they're quoting, or Nisha Mitzpeh, and I should look that up. But when you learn actually Masechet Shkalim, you see that some of the sources that are quoted were actual Kohanim. These people were people presumably actually saw what was going on, or were immediately after. These are early sources.
Wasn't there a written document or something like this?
Not necessarily, right? Because this is Mishnah, it's Torah Sheba'al Peh.
But maybe the Kohanim, they had something which was written down with
So you might think, but first of all, remember, part of that is because this is what we do. but I think two things. One, I mean, this is based on some other sources I know from the Gemara, that really there was a much sharper distinction between Torah shebichtav and Torah sheba'al peh, right? So the Torah shebichtav really was written down, and we also know from that there was that were written down that did not end up becoming part of Tanakh, right? And we know this both from sources in Chazal. We certainly know it from Kidvei Yam HaMelech and Qumran. We know that there were a lot of other books that didn't make it. But Mishnah, the idea of Torah Sheba'al Peh per se, apparently this was not written down in a kind of a fixed way. The Gemara does say elsewhere that some of the Tanaim would write Lot Starim, right? So this phrase, Megillat Starim, like a hidden Megillah, is a reference to this idea that apparently some of them did write down some of the traditions that they were carrying. But it really doesn't come to be written down in a complete and organized fashion until the time of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. However, what you're hinting at, or what the point that you're raising, or whether this is your intention or not, but I think it was at least part of your intention. Apparently there were right? We see there's machlot about things that were done every day in the Beit HaMikdash. In other words, the Gemara here is discussing now we have contradiction between the Mishnah in Yoma and the Mishnah in Tamid. And so we have saying, oh, that was two different Tanaim. So that's a typical Gemara answer, right? So the Gemara, when it tries to reconcile two conflicting sources, if it can, will uphold both sources by explaining, oh, this one's talking about this and this one's talking about that. So the Gemara doesn't
But here
do
you
that.
have facts, you don't have opinions. When you have opinions, then I do understand it, but when you have facts, either it was that way or the other way, or maybe there was already a machloket with the Kohanim themselves, and they have masorot shonot, and maybe one group did it that way and another group did it. How do they call these groups? They have a name for it in Hebrew. I don't remember it.
You mean like the Mishmarot? Different Mishmarot.
The various families, they did avodah for a week or 2 weeks and so on.
The Batei Avot.
Yeah, something like this.
Yeah, there were the Mishmarot subdivided into the Batei Avot. First of all, that's possible, right? We don't. So this is you're raising a good point, because what's happening. Let me just go back to the way I was laying it out. So we have the Mishnah here in Yoma. We have it contradicts the Mishnah in Tamid. So we say, okay, that the Mishnah. We end up by saying the Mishnah in Yoma was brought to us from Rabbi Shimon Ish HaMitzpeh. And that was not true of the Mishnah in Tamid. We didn't attribute yet the Mishnah in Tamid to any particular Tana, but not Rabbi Shimon Ish HaMitzpeh. So that immediate question, but it doesn't answer your question. So your question is, how could there have been a machloket about something that actually happened in the Beit HaMikdash, right? So one answer is that there was actual machloket in the Beit HaMikdash, and that is a possibility. The other possibility is that there was no machloket in Mikdash, but one generation, people got mixed up. Somebody learned it differently, but it's not completely arbitrary, because, and we won't all of this now, I'm not sure if we'll go through it in this, but the Gemara actually goes to the reasoning for each of these approaches about the order. Each of them have reasons to do it in the order that they say. So on that note, I want to pick up. We'll discuss this a little bit more. So first we reconcile the Mishnah in Yoma with the Mishnah in Tamid by saying they're two different sources, right? And so of course that still leaves the question that Paul asks, but we're going to set that aside for a moment. But then a more immediate problem, because okay, let's say the Mishnah in Yoma was written by Rabbi Shimon Ish HaMitzpeh, but how will we reconcile the Mishnah in the first parak? It says he was maktir et aktoret and meitiv et hanerot, and the Mishnah in the second parak, which says that the pious would be first, the second pious would be including hatavat hanerot, and haktarat Torah would be the third pious, which means that it must come after hatavat hanerot, right? The Rami Seder Yoma Didnan Payis Hasheni Mishochet Mizoreg Mimidashen Mizbeach Hapnimi Umimidashen Et Amnora Mimalei Varim Lekevesh Payis Hashlishi Chadashim Aktor Bo Vafisu. So how can I reconcile that Mishnah in the second parak with what we just learned here in the first parak? So Marbaye Lokasha Kan Batavat Shtei Nerot Kan Bahatavat Chamesh Nerot. So this seeming internal conflict between the Mishnah in the first chapter and the Mishnah in the second chapter, Abaye can answer that because he introduces now the idea that Hatavat Nerot was really split into two parts. So we learned this when we learned the Mishnah in Tamid, but as it were, we're learning it now for the first time. The Abaye is introduced now in this context for the first time, Yoma. So how does that answer the question?
They're both right. It's referring to the earlier with the menorah is for the first two, and then the second reference is to the second five.
Okay, so let's see how this works out.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Shir, we don't hear you.
Could you hear me? Okay.
Now we hear you, so go ahead.
Fine. Sorry,
Yes.
I want a little bit correction so if I understood it the right way. So first the 5 lamps, then the incense, and then the 2 lamps. So
Yes.
I understood.
I'm sorry. So yeah.
So the order of cleaning the ashes of the menorah is 5 lamps, then the interruption by incense, and then the 2 lamps in the end. So I want to a little bit to
Yes. I'm sorry, and if you lied it over that, I apologize. But yes, that's how we learned it.
Yeah.
That's what Abaye is referencing here. So kan in the case where so here, hold on a second. Let's see how Rashi lays this out. Kan batavat shtei man beperek shlishi, right? So that's the parak that we're actually starting from. Amrinan shemafsik batavat nerot tiv chamesh, right? So the person who goes in to do hatavat nerot, he's metiv 5 nerot. Posek, he stops. Mamti shenasa avoda acheret beintaim. He waits for another avodah to be done. The chozer metiv shtayim, and then he goes back to do the other 2. Upliga Abba Shaul v'Rabbana. And on this, there's a machloket later on in the third parak between Shaul and the Rabbanan. Ikan lamanda amar biktoret mafluhu. So you notice the way Rashi phrased this. That here it says, in the 3rd chapter, it says he's mafsik b'atavat haneirot, that after he does the 5, he's mafsik ba'avod posek u'mamtin at shenasa avodah acheret. He'd say what the avodah is. He just says that there is a hapsaka of another avodah between the first 5 and the latter 2. So now he goes into this a little bit more. Here there's a market between Abba Shaul and the Rabbanan. Ika lamanda amar biktoret mafahu. One manda amar, one of these 2 opinions, Abba Shaul or the Rabbanan, says that after the 5 neirot, then the Ktoret would be brought, and then the Tzot. Another one says that it was interrupted. The Hamnorah was interrupted after the first with the Shlita of the Tamid and Zrikata. Kaman mefarish ta'amat zakah. Later on, it explains the reason for breaking up the menorah into 2 parts. The Tana Didan, which we actually saw some of that, a summary of that in the Bartanura back in Tamid, and we'll look again. The Farish Tamid of Sakha Didan, our Tana here in the first parak of Yoma, Svirle Biktoret Mafsiklu. Our Tana holds that he was mafsik with Ktoret, Hilkach, Hatiktani Ktoret Beresha, V'hatavat Shtei Neirot Ka'amar. V'hadidnan Hatava Beresha, V'hatavat Chamesh Rishonot Ka'amar. So therefore what? In the 1st chapter here, where'd it go? To hear what Huzoreket Adam, Maktirat Aktoret, Umeitiv et Haneirot. Right? So that's what Rashi's saying. Tana Didan Srile Bigoret, Mafsik, Luhu Hilkach Hadiktanik Toret Beresha, it says when he's in our it says that he was maktir the Ktoret, umeitiv et haneirot. Which neirot was he meitiv? The 2 neirot, the end. V'hadinan hatava beresha. Later on in the 2nd chapter, when it lays out the order of the paisot, and the hatavata neirot is in the 2nd pais, and Tarat is in the 3rd pais. So what's that talking about? That's a reference to the idea that the first 5 neirot will be done before Taktoret. So Abaye, this machoka between Abba Shul and Rabbanan, I can say we'll look at that. I don't think we'll have time today, but we will look at it. It'll be referenced again here in this sugya. For our purposes, this is what we've got so far. We understand that in the order that is laid out in Masechet Tamid not the order that's laid out, but the avodah that's laid out in Masechet Tamid is one opinion, the opinion of the Rabbanan, and the avodah as it's laid out in our Masechet in Yoma is going to be according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Isha Mitzpeh. We then had an internal contradiction between our first mishnah in the 1st chapter, which implied that the order of the avodah would be haktarat haktoret and then hatavata neirot, and it was implied in the 2nd chapter that it was the other way around. That first there would be hatavata neirot, and then haktarat haktoret. And we reconciled by saying that Abai reconciles them by saying they don't disagree The first chapter is talking about it's talking about the 2 neirot that were done at the end. The second chapter is talking about the 5 neirot that were done first. But each of those, so once again, when we learn the Mishnah in the first chapter, we understand that the Mishnah there is actually not telling us all of the avodot. We know that because we've learned later on in Yoma, we learned all of Masechet Tamid. We know that there are a lot of things that it's skipping, and so when the few things that it says are just to be like a quick summary of the avodot that the Kohen Gadol had to practice all week, but we still need to understand how the order works, right? So even though it doesn't all of the avodot, but the avodot that are brought have to be in order. Now, I might also ask, why does the Mishnah make it so complicated? In the sense that, why doesn't the Mishnah in either the first chapter or in the second chapter, or even later on in the third chapter, or even when we were learning Masechet Tamid, it was more mefurash. In other words, in Masechet Tamid, we did understand that there's 5 and 2. But here in Yoma, it's explicit. It's not explicit. Abai has to bring it in. So again, and I think this is something that we're going to understand as we go through more and more of Yoma. Yoma is not comprehensive in all of the avot. It's not going to describe all of the avot that were done in the Beit Hamikdash Yom Kippurim. It's really, to some degree, relying on Masechet Tamid and other sources to fill that out. And so I think, I mean, this is just my personal opinion, but I think like the Tana here in the first chapter isn't concerned about listing everything that the Kohen Gadol had to practice all week. But now that we're getting down to it, we do have to understand the order. And so now we've introduced this idea that the Dishun Amnora and Hatavat Hanerot, that was split into 2 parts. Okay, so now Rashi has teed us, as it were, has prepared us for the next question in the Gemara. Gemara, now Abai is given his answer. Kan batabat shtei nerot, kan batabat chamesh nerot. The Gemara says, "L'meimra de biktoret mafsik lahu." So is this to say that hatavat of the menorah were interrupted by the Ktoret? V'ha Abai mesader ma'aracha mishmei the Gemara b'dama tamid maklu. When Abai himself lays out the Seder HaMaracha, the Seder HaMaracha, the Maracha, as we know, refers to Amara was right a particular fire that burnt on the Mizbeach. But the Seder HaMarachas is like the title for lining up and giving the Seder for all of the Avodot that were done in the Beit HaMikdash on any given day. So Abaye, when he lays out HaMaracha Mishmad Gemara in the name of the Gemara, when the Gemara says Gemara, it means in the name of an oral tradition, right? Gemara just means learning, right? In the name of the received learning, Abai said that Hatat Hanerot of the menorah were interrupted bidama tamid mafsiklu. So Abai himself actually gives us a different, or he interrupts the God differently than what he says here. Just a second. Okay, yeah. So this is the Gemara Yoma Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph. This is actually the Gemara that's on our Mishnah that we started. And this is Abaye. Abaye misader ma'aracha mishmei de Gemara va'aliba da Abba Shaul. So this second part, as we'll see, is going to be very important, that when Abaye was laying this out, the order of the Maracha, he was saying this particular order according to Abba Shaul. Right? So Abaye, of course, is coming much later. He never Beit HaMikdash. One second, it's telling me the internet is unstable. Okay. Abaye, of course, never saw the Beit HaMikdash, so he's transmitting traditions that came from people who came from a much earlier time. So Abba Shaul was an early Tana, and Abaye is saying over the Ma'aracha in his name. So this order of the Ma'aracha, I think we've mentioned this before, this is the order that's brought in our standard Sidurim nowadays, right? When you go through Korbanot in the morning, this is what it's quoting. The Dur is quoting this Gemara. Ma'aracha Gedola kodemet Ma'aracha Shniya Shel Ktoret. So what's the Ma'aracha Gedola? So we learned this back in Tamid. So the Ma'aracha Gedola, Rashi says Ma'aracha Gedola Shalei Yaktiru Kol HaKtorot. They're going to burn everything on it. In other words, not literally everything, because the Torah is going to be burnt inside. We'll talk about that. But it means that the Evarim are going to be Maracha, and this Maracha, this was the one that they started and they set up in the morning. It was the eastern side of the Mizbeach, and it was the largest of three Marachot. Maracha Gedola Kodemet Maracha Shniya Shel Ktoret. That was before the second Maracha, that was for the Ktoret. Rashi explains, Kodem the Seder Neha Maracha Shniya Shosim the Karen Ma'aravit Dromi. Before they did the second Maracha, which was in the southwest side, that was up 4 amot from the south. Tzad Safon, Masechet Tamid, like we learned in Masechet Tamid. Shel Ktoret, and what does it mean that second was Shel Ktoret? Shemimena chotim gechalit nisel mizbeach b'nimi shacharit v'arvit aktir alei Ktoret tamid. Pras shacharit u'pras ben harbayim. Right. So we know this was where the Kohen who was charged with bringing the coals onto the mizbeach hapnimi, he would take it from second Maracha. Okay. So first they would set up the Maracha Gedola on the eastern side. Then they would set up the second Maracha on the western side. Maracha Shniya Shel Ktoret kodemet l'sidur shnei gzirei eitzim. So that was done. The next thing they would do was set up the 2 logs, and back to the main Maracha Shemesadrina Maracha Gedola. All the reasons for this are laid out later. And we learned most of this, right? Because the Gemara, the Tanaim learned it out from the way this is described in Vayikra. Then there's a mitzvah Gzirei Etzim on the fire every day, whether or not it needs it. So this was the order to do it. It was done after they set up second Maracha. The Sidur Shnei Gzirei Etzim Dishun Mizbeach HaPnimi. Then the next thing they would do, who would go in to clean off the Mizbeach HaPnimi, the Dishun Mizbeach HaPnimi, Kodem LaHatavat Chamesh Neirot. Then the next thing that would be done would clean the 5 Neirot, the 5, according to the way we learned it in Tamid, the westernmost Neirot on the menorah. About Chamesh Neirot Kodem L'Dam Hamid. The next thing, according to this Seder, Alibada Abba Shaul, would be after the 5 Neirot would be cleaned, then they would do dama tamid, meaning what? Like Rashi says, that at that point they would shech the animal, do the kabbalat dam, sprinkle the dam on the mizbeach. The dama tamid kodem hatavat shtei neirot. And the next thing would be the 2 neirot. Tavat shtei neirot kodem liktoret. According to this order, the Ketara was done entirely after the menorah was all the avodah of the menorah was completed. The Ketara kodem le'evarim. Then the next thing would be to bring up the evarim atzil mizbech. Evarim le'mincha, mincha le'chabitin, v'chabitin le'misachim. Right, the meal offerings and fine wine offering, those would be the last things. Okay, so according to this, and then it actually goes on musafin and so forth. I think eventually we'll come back to that. But for our purposes, we'll go back to our Gemara in Yudalad on the bet. So this is the Gemara's Kushya, right? Abaye here said that the Mishnah in the first chapter, where it says that he would burn the Ktoret and then he would be Netiv Neirot, meant that first he would burn the Ktoret and then he would be Netiv Neirot, but of course that would have, his Daktarat Ktoret would have been preceded by the Hatavat Chamesh Neirot. So on that, the Gas, the Memra de Biktoret Mafsikuhu, V'ha'abayi Misader Ma'aracha Mishmara, like we just saw, when Abaye lays out the maracha, he says that between the 5 neirot and the 2 neirot, the dam hatamid would have been sprinkled. In other words, the ta and the Kabbalah and the dam hatamid, that's what would have been done. And here Abaye is telling us that between the 5 neirot and the 2 neirot would be the Ktoret. So Amri lo kasha. So they say there's no contradiction. It's even Abaye is not really contradicting himself. Hahi la Abba Sha'u. The Seder Maracha that Abaye, that we quote later on, it's in the 3rd chapter, as it says there, he brought that according to Abba Sha'u. Ha la Rabbanan. But these other 2 Mishnayot are not going like Abba Shul, they're going like the Rabbanan. Titania, because we learn in a Braita, Lo yetiv rot yachar kach yaktir, el yaktir yachar kach yetiv. Abba Shul omer meitiv yachar kach maktir. So there's a Braita, there's a machloket between Abba Shaul and the Rabbanan. So what do the Rabbanan say? You should not do Hatav Neirot and then bring the Ktoret, then be Maktir the Ktoret. Rather, you have to be Maktir the Ktoret and then do the Neirot. The Abaye says no. First, you do all of the Neirot, and then you do Haktarat Haktoret. Let's look at Rashi here. So Rashi here, lo yetiv. So in the Braita it says, the Tanya, lo yetiv et haneirot. So what does it mean, lo yetiv et haneirot? Shiva atat. You shouldn't be netiv all 7. Yaktir, and then bring the Ktoret. El yaktir be'emtza. Rather, you should be maktir the Ktoret in the middle of Hatamat Neirot. Yachar kach yigmor hatavat shtayim, and then you can finish the last 2. V'ha leka l'meimar yaktir tchila, yachar kach yatchil lehetiv ka'amri rabbanan. In other words, when I read this Braita, I might think, what? It says, Lo yetiv et haneirot yachar kach yaktir, Ela yaktir v'yachar kach yetiv, and Abba Shul yetiv v'yachar kach maktir. Okay. On the first part, lo yitiv v'tanirot v'char kach yaktir, yaktir v'char kach yaktiv, v'char kach yetiv. What would I think if I had no other information? When it says yaktir v'char kach yetiv, what would I think that I do with what the hatavat neirot? What does it mean achar kach yetiv? First, I'm maktir the k'torah, and then I'm metiv et hamnorah. So when it says metiv et hamnorah, what would that means?
That you do all 7 at once.
You do all 7 at once. In other words, this terutz that Abaye brought in order to explain the first chapter and the mishnah in the second chapter, that we're referring to the 2 and we're here to the 5, I don't see that in the Braita. The Braita itself doesn't talk about splitting up the Neirot. So when I learned the Braita Stam, lo yetiv et haneirot, lo yetiv et haneirot v'char kach yaktir, I would think the plain shot is I shouldn't do dishun of all menorah and then bring the K'torah. Ella, I should bring the K'torah v'char kach yetiv, and then I should do the dishun of the entire menorah. So Rashi here is trying to explain. I don't really understand. We're not going to understand it like that, right? Lo yetiv shivatan, v'char kach yaktir, el yaktir emtza. So right, Rashi's adding in the be'emtza because the Braita doesn't say be'emtza. V'char kach yigmor hatavat shtayim. So now Rashi explains why he says the way he does. V'hal leka lemeimar yaktir tchila v'char kach yatchil lehetiv. You can't say what the Braita means is that you should do the Hatarat Aktoret first and only then begin to do Hatavat Neirot. Because actually we hold that you must break up the Hatavat Neirot. They need to be. It needs to be interrupted. V'chol avodot sturud zu achar zu al pi haktuvim lekaman b'milta. And Rashi doesn't give us the source here because he says the Gemara itself is going to tell us how the order of avodot is learned out from psukim. This is all going to be described later on in the sugya. We come to the Abaye, the thing that Abaye says. V'yafshar lahaktir, and you're not allowed to. It's impossible to. You're not allowed to be maktir ad le'achar zrikat dama tamid. You can't do the aktarat aktoret. The blood from the tamid has been spilled. V'yamart toret kodemet lahatavat atavat, and they wrote, if you say that burning the Ketorah precedes entirely taking care of the neirot of the menorah, ein lecha od avodah lahafsikan ba. You have no other avodah to interrupt it. So, in order to understand this question, we're going to have to learn a little bit more in the Gemara. But the idea is to learn out that you have to break up the Hatavat Neirot. That's something that's something that we're going to learn out. We'll look at it a little bit here, and then we'll see. But once I know that, it will take care of other things. But Rashi, in a sense, is letting us in on this now, because this Braita here is so terse. It just says lo yativ atanir v'char kach yaktir, yaktir v'char kach yativ. Rashi wants to make sure that you don't think that the Braita is telling me now that I can do hatavat neirot all at once. I still have to break it up. So when it says yaktir v'char kach yativ, it means that I'm going to interrupt the Hatavat Neirot with Haktarat Ktoret, and then I'll be Meitiv at the Neirot. So let's do a little bit more in the Gra. Wait 1 second. One second. There's a couple other Gemarat that I want to reference. Let's do a little bit from the beginning of this, or the next part of this sugya here. That my ta'amad Abba Shaul. So what's the reasoning of Abba Shaul? What's the basis for his shita? Ichtiv baboker hetivo et hanerot. The hadar yaktirena. So remember, Abba Shaul, excuse me. According to Abba Shaul, he says that you should some of the hatavat hanerot, then you should be maktir the ktoret, and then you should finish the hatavat hanerot. So he learned it out. So he learns it out here in Shmot. The first directives are being given for how to do these mitzvot in the Mishkan. Just a second. So this is the. Let's just look at the few psukim here. Sitim is miktar ktoret, atzei shitim tasel oto. Right, so there's a mitzvah to make the mizbeach ktoret, and then it gives us its dimensions. It has to be covered with gold and various other aspects of it. ונתת אותו לפני הפרוכת אשר אהרון העדות, לפני הכפורת אשר העדות אשר יגמרו בך שמה. Tells you where to place it in the משכן. והקטיר עליו אהרון קטורת סמים, בבוקר, והיטיבו את הנרות יקטירן. So, פשוטו של מקרא, we would say, right, every morning, בבוקר, we just understand that to mean every morning. That every morning, the Aaron is supposed to burn incense on the Mizbeach HaKtoret when he has Tivot HaNeirot Yaktirena. When he is the menorah. Rashi here is Shon Nikui, Nikui HaBzichin Shel Menorah Min Deshem HaPtilot Shnisrefu Balayla. Right? So this, we know this, right? The Hatavat Hanerot is to clean out the bezichin, the little, not so little, but the cups that were that held the oil and the wicks. But we, as a matter of pshat, we have to understand what is the Torah itself trying to describe to us here. That Aaron burns the incense while he's being meitiv the neirot, and then it says right after the v'ha'alot Aaron et neirot ben arbaim yaktirena. When Aaron is ma'aleh the neirot, when he's burning the neirot ben arbaim, that's when he should burn the incense. So tamid lifnei Hashem b'dorotei. In the morning, it talks about the Heitivot HaNeirot. In the evening, it talks about the bringing up of the lights. So, in other words, lights. So, back. So, my ta'amad Abba Shaul, dichtiv baboker be'eitiv neirot, bahadar yaktirena. In other words, the order that this is brought in the pasuk is first yitir alav ktoret samim baboker betivot behetivot and neirot yaktirena. So yaktirena comes at the end of the pasuk. It starts off v'hiktir alav, but Abba Shaul understands it is that yaktirena is at the end, so it means that hiktir alav aron ktoret samim after he's done hatavat neirot when he'll be maktir. Metivet kulam kodem lahaktarat lahaktoret lahafsaka b'dam tamid. So Abba Shaul understands that the Torah is telling me that first there has to be hatavat neirot, and then there has to be the red. It still doesn't tell me why he's broken up the hatavat neirot, but that we'll see. That's from the words baboker. Right? I think we learned that already in Tamid. So what about the Rabbanan? Right? So how do the Rabbanan disagree that the hatavat neirot is broken up not with the dam tamid? Rabbanan Maika Amma Rahmana. What is the Torah telling according to the Rabbanan? Be'edan hata tehei maktir ktoret. At the time that the hatava of the neirot is being done, that's when you should burn the ktoret. Dilote mahachi. Don't say it like that. Bein ha'arbaim dichtiv uvaha'alot aron et haneirot bein ha'arbaim yaktirena hachinami bereisha madlik neirot v'hadar maktir ktoret shel bein ha'arbaim. V'pitei mahachinami v'atay me'erev ad boker ten la midata shetei doleket v'lechet kol ha'mayla me'erev ad boker. It's funny the way they break this up here, but that's why I usually like to do my own sheets, but I didn't have time. So Rabbanan, the time that you're doing the hatava, that's when you should be maktir the k'torah. So they understand it that when the pasuk begins, Yiktir alav aron k'toret samim, and then behetivot and yirod yaktirena. There's an implication that while the k'toret is burning, is also when you do the hatavat neirot. So you're going to do it along with, not after. At the time that the hatava is being done, the k'toret should be burning. You have to be burning the k'toret. If you don't say that way, Yilote mahachi bein ha'arbaim, how are you going to understand what the Torah tells us about the burning of the incense and the neirot bein ha'arbaim? Because what does it say there? Uvaha'alot aron et haneirot bein ha'arbaim yaktirena. Achinami the bereisha madlik neirot. So here, what are you going to say? That first he's going to have to light the neirot, and then he's going to be matir k'toret shel bein ha'arbaim. That's what's going to be implied, because that's the way the pasuk seems to read. V'alot aron et haneirot ha'arbaim. First you light the candles, and then you're maktir the k'toret. In other words, what's the problem? Rabbanan disagree with Abba Shaul, and they say that hatavat neirot is not broken up by the k'toret. Abba Shaul wants to say that it comes after hatavat neirot. The Rabbanan to say, no, you have to do the k'toret during hatavat neirot. So it means you have to break up hatavat neirot into two parts. But what's their problem? The Torah describes these adot that are done bein ha'arbaim. So bein ha'arbaim, we have the pshuto shel mikra is that first Aaron is going to light the candles, and then he's going to be maktir the k'toret. But now, according to the Rabbanan, that's now what they say should be done in the morning, right? So then it's going to come out in the evening that first he's going to light the candles and maybe maktir the Ktoret. So maybe you'll say, okay, yeah, but that's just the way the ball bounces. That's the way it works out. He has to be metiv the nerot and burn the menorah, and then he'll do the Ktoret in the afternoon. V'hatanya me'erev ad boker. But I have a braita that tells me that when he does the nerot, he has to put in enough. He has to burn them away michutz paroch ad asher ha'idut paroch oto Aaron ubanav me'erev ad boker l'shem plukat olam b'dorotam me'et b'nei Yisrael. Right. So the candles are being burned on the menorah. You have to burn from evening until morning. What's that mean from evening till morning? You have to burn it from evening till morning. Tein la midata, shtei doleket volechet kol halayla me'erev ad boker. So the first drasha is, it means you have to put in enough oil that it's going to burn all night. Davar acher me'erev ad boker, this is for us. There's another drasha that's learned out. What does it mean that it's me'erev ad boker? Ein lecha avoda shekshera me'erev ad boker ela zu bilvad. Well, actually, what it teaches me is that the very last avodah of the day is going to have to be the burning of the candles of the menorah. There is no avodah that's kshera from the evening until the morning except this one. So what would that mean? What would that tell me about the Ktoret? When would the Ktoret have to be?
Would have to be earlier than that. I mean, if that's the last Avodah, it would have to be earlier.
Has to be earlier than that, right? So remember, the Rabbanan say that the Ktoret is done during Hatavat Nerot. You break up Hatavat Nerot, and then we have a problem because it seems like Ben Ha'arbayim, the Torah is telling me that I'm going to do the Ktoret after Hatavat Nerot. So, Kitei Mahachinami. Maybe you'll say, okay, but maybe when you do that, maybe that's the way it works out, Ben Ha'arbayim. But the Rabbanan say no, because I have a drasha that says Erev ad Boker. The Erev ad Boker tells me that this is the only avodah that goes from the end of the day, from the beginning of the evening until the next morning. So rather, what do I understand? What is the Torah really trying to tell me? Even though these two psukim that we see in Shmot, Pasuk Zayin and Pasuk Chet, in Perek Lamed, seem to be saying slightly different things. What it's telling me is that just like in the morning, you have Torah has to be burning when you're doing Hatavat Meirov. This is also true Bein Ha'arbayim. So that's the way the Rabbanan understand. Yabashu alach shani hatam dichtiv oto. Shaul says it's different there because the Torah we skipped these Rashis. Let's do the Rashis here. We'll see Abba Shul, and I think that'll be it for this evening. So Rashi says this is going back to the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan say that you have to do the Ktoret during the time of Hatavat Nerot and can't be the last thing that's done for the day. And maybe you'll say it is the last thing that's done for the day, but the Torah says, Me'erev ad boker, Rashi explains what is Me'er Boker b'Neirot K'tiv. It's talking about the Neirot, as we saw. V'aroch oto Aaron b'nav Me'er Boker. So the first drasha is Tein la l'menorah midat shemen k'dei shteidoleket kol halayla. Put in enough oil that it's going to stay lit all night. And then he tells us, you have to put in a half a log for each of the 3 lamps. Right? In other words, that's enough to burn through the longest night of the year, which would be in Tevet. And if any left over, so they'll be left over. But that's what they would do every day, all year around. They would put in Hatzi log, that it would burn the whole night. But what's the second drasha? Davar acher, me'erev ad boker ein lecha avodah shekshera me'erev ad boker ela zu bilvad. Klomar, Rashi says, avodat yom kshera achar hadlakatan. There is no avodah of the day that will be kasher once you light the candles. The darish hafi, oto me'erev v'ad boker. Acher me'erev ad boker. Right? That's the lashon of the pasuk. Wait a second. It's not the right pasuk. It's the pasuk here. Yom Oein Michutza Parocha D'Shel Ha'idut Yaroch Oto Aharon V'Banav Me'erev Ad Boker L'Pnei Hashem Chukat Olam Dorotam. Right, so Yaroch Oto, that the Narach, the menorah will be set up Me'erev Ad Boker. So it's the drasha is Oto Me'erev Ad Boker. Only that can go from night until the next morning. So Abba Shul Melach Shani Hatam Dichtiv Oto. So Abba Shul says, okay, Ben Harba different because it says Oto. And Rashi says Kidberishit, as I explained. In other words, that in the evening specifically the Torah said the last avodah has to be the avodah of the Neirot. So there, Abba Shul is going to agree that Ben Harabayim, the Torah will have to be burning when you're lighting the menorah. Well, Shacharit, the Seder Mashma'o Shel Nikra, Seder Ha, Behetivo, Bahadar Yiren. So, but Abai Shaul is still going to stick to his original shita that in the morning, because it talks about Hatavat Neirot and only afterwards it says Yakti Rena, that tells me that first I have to complete Hatavat Neirot and then I have to bring Torah. So this is a machloket now between Abul and the Rabbanan. I think I'm going to stop the Gemara here. I'm going to, and just to bring up a little discussion here now. Aside from the question that Paul asked, sort of a practical question: is there an historical aspect to this? Did they do it one way? Did they do it the other way? But I think it's also a conceptual question. What difference does it make? I'm sorry, somebody was. I'm not necessarily going to try to answer this right now, and neither do you have to answer this right now. But is this just all nitpicking? Does it really matter? In other words, one says you have to do the Torah, then you have to do. Apparently, there's something going on here, right? In other words, there must be something very important going on that the Torah is laying out the order in which things are supposed to be done. And then but we see there's room for misunderstanding, or there's room for more than, I shouldn't say misunderstanding, but more one understanding. So we might want to understand what does the Torah feel that we're accomplishing when we're lighting the menorah, and what are we accomplishing when we're burning the Keteret, and what are we accomplishing when we are throwing blood on the Mizbeach, right? So these are the three things that come in the same time frame. And the order here is apparently very important. So I'll just leave it as a question to mull over. Next time I want to continue actually with some of these other details. I didn't get to it's another Gemara in the second chapter that I want to look at, and a couple of other things, but I want to, like, little by little, we don't have to jump all the way to Perushim throughout the ages on this, but just to think about, you can, do your own research just on Chumash. What did the Mefarshim say? What did the Midrashim say? If you want to take a look, what's the point of the menorah? What's the point of the Keteret? What's the point of Damat Tamid? And how are they interacting with each other? When we were learning the Masechet Tamid, we did this to some degree. We were trying to point out what was happening. There were certain things that were happening simultaneously, right? Because we talked about the people who go in to do Dishun HaMizbeach HaPnimi and Dishun HaMenorah, they make the sound when they open the sha'ar of the Heichal, and that's the signal to the shochet to be shochet. So that there's this orchestration going on. And then the other thing is, we need to keep, we should keep it. Remember that now on Yoma Kippurim, Bal Korchenu, right? Willy-nilly, Avodot will have to be done one after the other. They can't be done, there is no simultaneity. The Kohen Gadol has to do them, and he has to do them in a particular order. So why is the order important? Why should that be important? Anyway, something to think about. Okay, any other comments, questions?
Well, with the prayer, you also have an order. You could also ask yourself, why should I say this bracha after the Birkot Shema? Maybe I could say the second before the first, or some things like that. But there is an order, If sometimes somebody does a mistake or makes it wrong, and then there are always people in the in the kahal which are really they are shouting. The world is crumbling because of that, or something like this.
Okay, well, one thing that you could say is that there's an order because, as we say, Leman Seder Atov. In other words, you want to keep things in order. And one of the basic reasons that you have an order for any set of tasks is a way of ensuring that you do all the tasks. If it's haphazard and you just do them whatever order you want on any given day, you could easily skip one or two, right? And this is the whole idea of having a seder. We have, that's the word seder that we have for Leilas. We have, because we have a lot of mitzvot to do on the Leil HaSeder, we want to make sure we do all of them. That's also why we call the Sidur. These tefillot, and we want to make sure that we say all the tefillot. We also know that there are different nuschaot that change around certain aspects of the order. Let's say in Psukei de Zimra, there are different nuschaot and whatnot, and some of the other sort of secondary things.
At the end of the tefillah, the nusach Sfarad, the nusach Ashkenaz, which doesn't end the same way.
Right. There are a number of differences, like when you say Shir Shel Yom, how you do an Afik Aleinu, and then Shir Shel Yom, and they're all different things. But I think, to come back to what I was saying before, I think there is this aspect, we do things according to a certain order because we want to make sure we do everything. But then that begs the question, what difference does it make which order we choose? Here we see the machloket between Abba Shaul and the Rabbanan. To them, the order is very important. At the that Abba Shaul even says, the order that you do it in the morning is actually not the same order you do it Bein Ha'avai. And the Rabbanan seem to think that it's important that you do it the same in the morning and Bein Ha'avai. So I think that there is something implied here that the order is important. Plus, if you remember way back a few months ago when we learned, Parshat Achrei Mot, in the beginning of Parshat Achrei Mot, the Torah lays out presumably what the order is that the Kohen Gadol is supposed to do on Yom Kippurim. So basically, what we're trying to do here, I mean, one of the things that we're trying to accomplish in this shiur generally is trying to understand how Chazal saw these orders. That we saw the Sechet Tamid as a kind of summary of the order of every day. Then we have the order of things that are brought in Achrei Mot, and now we have to put them all together, right? Because on Yom Kippurim, all of those things have to be done, and presumably the order is the order Ma'akev. That's another question, but at least l'chatchila there should be a certain order. Anyway, so Shira, did you want to say something, or do you want to leave it?
No,
Okay.
the next one.
Okay. So thank you, everybody. Have a
Thank
good
you.
evening.
Good night. Thank
Night.
you.